Hello, and welcome to the synopsis of my paper on art policy and advocacy for the city of Sausalito. Look behind me and you'll see the houseboats of Sausalito, one of which belongs to my great college professor in art history, and I just want to do a shout out to her, but I won't mention her name because that's her private residence. But getting into art history and to art leadership and art and cultural management makes us consider Sausalito, which was well known as an art colony in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and has somehow or other fallen off that pedestal. What is the reason? And the reason is, from my point of view, having lived here in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and the past 2 decades of the 21st century, is the loss of affordable live-work space for artists. Look at all these houseboats. They're actually in all directions around us. If I can swing this camera, you'll see many houseboats that were built by artists and artisans, musicians and composers, sculptors, artists of all kind. And for the most part today, they cannot afford to live here. In fact, in this very community where I lived as a 15-year-old runaway, there were many hundreds more boats. Just in the past 5 years, over 250 live-work house boats and boats where artists and others lived have been removed from the bay. On land, hundreds of live workspaces have been removed over the past 40 years that I have witnessed. Today, no live workspaces are allowed on land on this side of the railroad tracks. Over here behind me, you can see where Highway 101 comes down the hill, and there's a railroad grade that goes alongside it north to south from Mill Valley to the ferry landings in Sausalito. But those, the places that used to exist for artists to survive, that they built themselves with their own materials, their own know-how, no longer allowed, and that's a shame. My thesis is that with the new laws in the state of California that force communities to build housing, for example, in the city of Sausalito, 724 housing units are to be built within the next 8 years, and yet there are plans for none. The state of California has a system in place with new laws that allow the building of these units to go forward without local city and county approval. And I'm proposing to the city of Sausalito to allow 724 live-work lofts to be built for artists to inhabit, to recreate the fame and fortune of Sausalito as a bona fide art colony. I'll take you to some of the places in Sausalito that can be converted to live workspaces, because with these new California laws, zoning may no longer be a factor. Environmental impact reports may no longer be a factor. The needs of people for places to live is essential, and the state of California has recognized this, and many wealthy communities, such as Sausalito has become, have prevented any building of any units of any kind for decades. Now, you could say the chickens have come home to roost, and the best way for Sausalito to provide these 724 units is with live workspaces for 1 or 2 occupants who can certify themselves as artists, either with a vast body of work or the more normal way, which is with a degree in the fine arts from a university. Second to that, there must be so many low-income units included with what's called the builder's remedy, where people can build these units even without government approval. The Section 8 federal policy for housing assistance provides proof that a person or a family is low enough income that their rent could be subsidized. If the requirements to move into these live-work lofts are, say, 30 to 50% Section 8, with Section 8 vouchers provided by the state of California for living in the live-work spaces for bona fide productive artists, and not lawyers or bankers or others who make their full-time living in the financial or other departments, but instead actually are artists, but who maybe cannot afford to live as artists because housing is so expensive in California. So that's enough for an introduction. Let me take you to some of the places that are open and available for building live workspaces for literally hundreds of artists in the city of Sausalito. Thank you. So I just stopped along the trail here to take as close a picture I can of the yellow ferry. You can see that smokestack in the distance. There's another yellow smokestack. There's another ferry boat nearby. There's an old A-frame and a bunch of other houses here hidden behind the trees. This is the area where the great artist Jean Varda and the great philosopher Alan Watts both lived. Currently, there are some private studios here, like the Wheelhouse Private Studio and others. But if they're on land, they're almost always not allowed to be a live workspace. Some exist, but they're very few. Behind me is the Galilee Harbor Co-op, and it's an art community here in Sausalito that's thrived for 30 or 40 years. But they spent a good 20 to 30 years negotiating the rights to stay as artists or maritime workers on their boats. From the derelict docks and buildings that used to be here, it's now a modern dock and a modern headland space with open space. And all this was negotiated by the artists who lived here, again, over a long period of time, with many legal battles. Sausalito can't afford that amount of time for artists to create their creative spaces right now. The directive of the state of California to produce 724 new dwelling units, we can do this right away by specifying that the new live-work lofts are for artists of every kind: musicians, sculptors, painters, writers, dancers, everybody who's an artist. And that will really create a lot of buzz for the town of Sausalito. Now this is Galilee Harbor. Let's go see some potential places where we can right away build new housing. Now this old building from World War II helped us build 300 giant ships to tankers and freight ships and troop carriers to carry on the war effort in the Pacific. And this is one of the few buildings that remains in its intact state. You can see here behind me a number of other buildings that have been converted from the wartime use to modern office buildings. This one that remains here is a site of a lot of controversy because people want to build in the spot, but there's so many things that stand in the way, which brings us to dealing with climate change and sea level rise. This area here doesn't really get the ocean water coming over it, but it does flood with the rainwater when the drainage is filled. There's only about 2 feet above mean high tide here at this place. Now, if we're dealing with all these buildings, they need to be raised 3 to 5 feet. So if this particular building was converted into live-work artist lofts, this one building itself could hold over 80 live-work lofts, single or double residency. But if the foundation was raised 3 to 4 feet, that would mitigate, along with this road and these other buildings all raised, that would do a lot towards mitigating ocean level rise. Behind me, you see the U.S. Corps of Engineers buildings of the Bay model. It's a hydrological feature that demonstrates all the currents with real water in real channels that mimic the entire Bay Area system. But what I'm showing you is these buildings are all these same old World War II buildings, all converted into modern structures without taking out their bones, but building upon these historic structures. This is the same kind of look that we could achieve with the other World War II buildings that are now derelict if we use them for building artist lofts, live-work spaces. As we come down the waterfront, we come to a place where I can show you some paintings by the famous local artist Beau Van Beau. And man, Beau Van Beau was an African-American man who survived for many years as an artist, both in film and as a painter. But because of the lack of affordable lofts and living space, he often lived in the bushes or on small little boats, one of which I sold him. Beau Van Beau, an amazing person, produced probably 30,000 paintings in his life. If there was housing, he may have survived another 10 or 20 years. Just a wonderful character, and it was a pleasure to know him. And for our final location today in Sausalito, we're looking at the ICB, the Industrial Center building. It's full of a lot of artist lofts, but they're not live-work lofts. They're strictly work. Let's go inside and count how many there are, because if we could convert all these by zoning into live-work lofts, that would already add a lot of housing to Sausalito. Coming inside this vast building, look at the directory. And you can count over 80 work lofts, art studios. Looking at the fire map, you can see these 80 art studios. I just don't want to show too much detail of all the artists who work here. There's so many studios to go into. Again, there's 80 of them. And it's just fantastic. And you just want to be an artist and live in a place like this. But this is what it is, this building. Conveniently labeled on the old World War II photograph, where all these ships were built. And most of these buildings that we went by, at the lower left-hand corner is that machinist building that I stood in front of for part of this video. All this land And all these buildings is the area we're talking about. And across the hill there is Marin City, where the workers used to go and where Jack Kerouac lived for a short time. Okay, so here is today's newspaper. Front page, banner headline, Marin sued over housing element. All the local communities are up in arms over the fact that houses are going to be built in a way that nobody wants, because everybody wants their property values to go up. The state of California, this article says, is demanding 3,569 more residents being built in just the county of Marin. And of course, 724 of those are in the city of Sausalito. It's going to be done. We just need to make sure that art, creative housing gets its foot in the door so that Sausalito can again be an active art colony. Thank you everybody for watching.